Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Grace Lutheran Podcast. This is Pastor Matt Neupel. Thank you for tuning into our program today as we discuss different issues about our faith and lives in Jesus Christ. And if you live in the Winston-Salem or Paughtown area and you're looking to do something a little bit more traditional this year for Holy Week and Easter, you are always invited to join us every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. and every major festival during Holy Week at 7 p.m. at 3410 Community Church Road in Paughtown. Well, it's hard to believe that Lent is almost over, but what that means is Holy Week and Easter is right around the corner. And this year, we here at Grace are celebrating an Easter Vigil service for the first time. And so this is a service that's going to be new for a lot of us. And so I thought I would take today's episode to explain all of the different components and steps of this service, things that might be a little bit unfamiliar or confusing. As someone who leads a community of faith and worship on a regular basis, it's very important to me that those who participate in that worship understand why they're doing the things that they're doing. Because if we don't know why we're doing what we're doing, then we're really just a bunch of folks who are doing all these really strange, ancient practices that don't really have a lot of deeper purpose for our lives. But Christians have gathered to observe this Easter Vigil for over 1,000 years for a reason. And all of the seemingly strange details of this service do have a deeper meaning. So that's what we'll be talking about today. We're going to walk through an Easter Vigil service, and I will do my best to explain each step as we go along. First, it may be worth just making a few comments about the history of the service. And I have to make a slight correction because earlier I said that this service is over 1,000 years old. Well, it might be more accurate to say that this service is almost 2,000 years old. We see examples of Christians writing and talking about this service as early as the 3rd century, and they're talking about it in a way that tells us that it's probably been going on for a long time. The church historian Eusebius gives us an account of what Easter Vigil looked like in his day, writing in about 331 AD. And so this is what he says. This sacred vigil transformed the night into the brilliance of day by lighting throughout the whole city of Milan pillars of wax, while burning lamps illuminated every house, so that this nocturnal celebration was rendered brighter than the brightest of day. Not too long after this, in about 394 AD, Gregory of Nyssa is preaching an Easter sermon, and he describes Easter Vigil as this glowing night which links the splendor of burning lamps to the morning rays of the sun, thus producing continuous daylight without any darkness. So from the early church, we get this beautiful image of entire cities that had so many burning candles and lamps that when you walk through the city streets, it feels like daytime. And as Gregory of Nyssa tells us, all of this is in celebration of the spiritual sunrise that takes place in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And so this light was carried all throughout the night until the real Easter sunrise the next morning. So the word vigil comes from a Latin word that means awake. And so by now you can probably tell that originally the service was meant to last from the evening on Saturday all the way until Easter morning at sunrise. Now before anyone at Grace gets too worried, our Easter Vigil is much shorter now than it was when the early church celebrated it. Even though some people still complain that the Easter Vigil service is too long. But hopefully you'll soon appreciate why each step of this historic service is so necessary. So now let's talk a little bit about the service itself. Those who attended our Easter sunrise last year may be a little bit familiar with this part because we did sort of a modified version of this to begin our service last year. We start our Easter Vigil at Grace down in a small courtyard next to our gazebo. When members and guests arrive, they'll see me. They'll see a beautiful stone cross we use as a backdrop for this occasion. They'll see our tall Paschal Candle, and they'll see a small bonfire pit with charcoal. So there's no easy way to say this without sounding selfish, but let's start with me. Or let's start with whatever the pastor typically wears to begin this vigil service. If the church celebrated a foot washing for Maundy Thursday, then the pastor will have no stole, no cross, and no other kind of outward vestments besides their alb. This is in keeping with the Maundy Thursday tradition of the minister removing their outer vestments, a reflection of the reading from John 13 that tells us that before Jesus washed the disciples' feet, he laid aside his outer garments. So when this happens, the minister doesn't have any kind of outward vestments on until the first Alleluia of Easter. If the church didn't celebrate a foot washing and only read a Lord's Supper passage, then the minister will be wearing whatever vestments were worn for Good Friday. And at Grace, our liturgical color for Good Friday is black. Whether the minister is wearing black or no outward vestments, the image we're given is the same. The faith leader's outward anticipation of the resurrection, or the light of Christ coming into the world, is a reflection of the faith community's anticipation of the resurrection. So this next part, while it's not necessarily an Easter Vigil specific thing, it is worth giving a shout out to one of our members, Rusty Bates, who donated a beautiful stone cross for us to use for occasions like this. So in the past, it served us really well as a backdrop for our worship when we have worship outside. And so we'll continue to use it this way for our Easter Vigil coming up. Next, you'll see our Paschal Candle. And this is also called the Christ Candle. And we'll talk more about that as we go on throughout the service. But again, it's worth giving a shout out to another member, Mark Voigt, who created a beautiful wooden stand for this candle that we'll continue to use. But you won't see that stand yet. That's actually in the sanctuary. But that will be important later. So for now, we have the Paschal Candle outside. And so that's going to be the first light of this service. Finally, you'll see a fire pit with charcoal inside. And so this tradition of beginning Easter Vigil with a bonfire goes all the way back as far as we can tell. But here at Grace, we have a charcoal pit because this is a reflection of the Gospel of John that tells us that Peter, when he denied Jesus Christ before his crucifixion, he denied his Lord in front of a charcoal fire. But then after the resurrection, after Jesus comes to Peter, and Peter jumps out of the boat and comes swimming to Jesus, we read that Jesus forgives Peter 3 times in front of a charcoal fire. So in this image of charcoal, we see a symmetry of our sin and Christ's love and his willingness to forgive that sin. As members and guests arrive, they'll be given an individual candle, and those will be lit later on in the service. But for now, the service begins as close to sunset as possible with the lighting of the Paschal Candle. The minister will likely say a short prayer and then take the Paschal Candle and take a flame from the charcoal fire and light the Paschal Candle. Then they'll take this already tall candle and raise it up really high in the air, and they'll announce, either by saying or chanting, the light of Christ. At which point the assembly is invited to respond by saying, "Thanks be to God." This is our first obvious clue as to what something represents for us throughout the liturgy. And so we get a sense that this light on the Paschal Candle is meant to represent the light of Jesus Christ. In the Gospel of John, we're given this image of the light of the world being Jesus Christ, who comes into the world to break our darkness. And so as the sun sets, the light of the world, Jesus Christ, becomes brighter and becomes our source of light in the darkness. So then the minister leads the assembly in procession into the church. And so when they leave the charcoal fire, the assembly is meant to follow them and follow the light of Christ into the church building. Some versions of this liturgy will say it's best to take the longest route possible to get into the church. Safely, of course, but this is meant to represent the Exodus for us, the wandering of the Israelites in the wilderness before they could enter the Promised Land. This is another really important representation of the Paschal Candle, because in the service later on we will see that the Paschal Candle also represents the pillar of fire, this burning light that we read about that was able to lead God's people in the wilderness during their exodus. So much like the Israelites followed this pillar of fire in the darkness and at nighttime to lead their way, we also follow this tall pillar of fire, this tall candle, in our darkness to lead our way before we can enter our promised land, the church. I believe this is the touch point between the story of Israel and the story we read about in the Old Testament and our story of faith, our story of repenting and believing in Jesus Christ. Because while this represents the Exodus, it also represents our story. Before we enter the church, we are outside of the church in darkness, and we can only perceive the light of God dimly, far away from us. The next part of the service is when the minister stops at the church doors. And so before stopping at the church doors, the minister again raises the Paschal Candle and announces, again either through chanting or saying, the light of Christ. And again, the assembly is invited to respond, "Thanks be to God." As the people of God enter the Holy Land, or the church, they announce their thanksgiving that God has delivered on his promise to lead them in a path of righteousness to the place of salvation. And so this is where it all comes together, because as soon as the minister enters the church, and as soon as the assembly follows in behind the minister, each person lights their individual candle that was given to them from the light of the Christ candle as they enter the sanctuary. This is where so much comes together for us, because we have to backtrack a little bit and think about how when Israel entered their promised land, they were still in sin. They weren't perfect. They weren't in a Garden of Eden like they thought they were going to be. We see that in the book of Joshua and in the book of Judges. Israel was still in a wilderness of sorts, but it was a wilderness of the heart. It was an exodus of the spirit. They were still separated from God because of their deeply rooted sin. But then in Jesus Christ, we learn that sin is an individual, interpersonal problem. And it's something that has to be solved within our personal being. And that's when, through Christ, the light of God is no longer at a distance from us. It's no longer at this tall, separated space away from us. But it comes down to us, and it lights our path individually. It lightens our darkness and illumines our path personally. So the light of Christ is no longer just on the Paschal Candle, but it comes to us and it lights every individual candle right before we enter the sanctuary. Another image that can be made is the image of the three wise men who were guided by a star or guided by a distant tall light to bring them to the baby Jesus. And so when they arrive, they worship. Just like when we arrive in the church, once this part of the service is complete, we begin our worship. Let's just pause here and talk about how many layers of meaning and how much scriptural purpose has been in this service so far. We see an image of Jesus Christ as the light of the world. We see the Israelites wandering after a light in the darkness. We see the wise men following after a star to find Jesus Christ. All of this points us to the Word of God, and it points us to the great story of God's salvation to all of us. So now, once everyone's candle is lit, they walk into a darkened sanctuary. And again, the light of Christ is guiding them in the darkness. What I love about this part of the service is that it shows us that even this holy, set-apart space, the sanctuary, even this space is at times shrouded in darkness. The church is not guaranteed a life that is full of brightness and joy and happiness, but darkness and sin is still a problem in this world. And in those times of darkness, we have to bear that light of Christ within us to light our path and hopefully light that path for others. Once everyone has entered the sanctuary, the individual candles should really be brightening the sanctuary. This is why it's important that the sanctuary be as dark as it possibly can for this part of the service. Now, this isn't always possible because of those who might have eyesight problems, those who might have young children trying to get to their pew safely. But the light and the dark contrast is meant to be really strong here for the reasons that we talked about earlier. Jesus Christ being the light of the world, surrounded by a world of darkness. So once everyone has found their place in the sanctuary, the minister will enter in behind everyone, and before placing the Paschal Candle in its stand, the minister will, for a third time, raise the Paschal Candle and announce or chant the light of Christ. At which point, again, the assembly is invited to respond with "Thanks be to God." After this, the minister places the Paschal Candle in its stand, and then they begin one of the most historic, one of the most important parts of this service, and that is the Easter Proclamation. In some traditions, this is called the Exsultet, and originally this was a long hymn that the minister would sing, and it was an invitation to worship, but it was also a prayer of blessing on the Paschal Candle. We have evidence of Christians singing this Easter Proclamation hymn as early as the 4th century AD, and it's likely that it was going on even earlier than that. Today, it's become a lot more common for ministers to just read the Exsultet, mainly because it's so long, but there are still a lot of traditions out there that will chant or intone the Exsultet. I was able to find a really impressive example of this on YouTube, and so I'll be posting a link in the description to the Easter Vigil celebrated by St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. And so the person singing the Exsultet is singing in English, and so this is a great example to listen to if you want to hear the Exsultet being sung and also see the visual of what this looks like on Easter Vigil, with people's candles being the only sources of light in the darkness, and the tall Paschal Candle being this bright light of Christ. Whether the Easter Proclamation is sung or said, there's a little bit of call and response throughout the Easter Proclamation. And so there's several points throughout the Exsultet where the minister will say, "This is the night," at which point the assembly is invited to repeat, "This is the night." Then finally, in response, the minister will say for a third time, "This is the night." As you can imagine, this sounds especially beautiful when the Easter Proclamation is chanted by the minister and the assembly. But even when it's just read out loud, this still adds a rhythm to the Easter Proclamation. And you can almost hear this threefold beat. This is the night, this is the night, this is the night. Today we often think of Easter and the resurrection taking place on the morning of Easter or after the sunrise has taken place. But if we pay attention to the text, it tells us that the morning and the sunrise was when the tomb was discovered empty, which tells us that Jesus rose from the dead during the night. And because on the Jewish calendar, the Jewish day began at sunset, then Jesus still rose on Easter Day. It was just the beginning of the Jewish day when it was still nighttime. So Easter Vigil is the true resurrection celebration. And it has been for the majority of Christian history because we've recognized that Jesus rose from the dead during the night, or at least into the early morning, when the sun was down. And so this goes back to what we said earlier about people celebrating Easter Vigil by lighting all of these bright lights throughout Saturday night, because they believed that when Jesus Christ rose from the dead, it was pitch black throughout the land. But his resurrection brings light into our world. And by defeating death, he defeats the darkness that once held us captive. So this brightness that's often associated with Easter Vigil is a testimony that by breaking forth from the tomb that night, even though the world was covered in darkness, Jesus Christ brought light into our world. And that he has conquered and that he has vanquished the darkness on our behalf. So I have to be honest, I was hoping that I could fit all of Easter Vigil into one episode, and that was probably a little bit too optimistic for me. We're not even halfway through this service yet, and we are almost out of time for today. Unfortunately, I only have so much time in a day to record these episodes. But stay tuned for the next few days. I will be uploading a part 2 soon. I do want people to hear this entire service before we actually have the service. But in the meantime, I hope you have a great next few days. Take care and God bless.